We are here tonight to talk about Union Street. We have a consultant team from Boston, the Sociable group, who has come out to help us try to identify where some of our issues are in Union Street and improvements in how we can make it better. We have a really exciting agenda for tonight. We're actually going to get out of the meeting room and go walk the street and do some discussion out in the street, which I think
Jessica, I did not wear my streetwalker clothes.
That's right, you can just rub it. You can say anything when you're on your way out.
Sorry, go ahead.
So just to back up a little bit of how we got here and a little bit of history. In 1999, the city applied for a grant through the Department of Housing and Community Development through a grant program called the Massachusetts Downtown Initiative, the MIDI program. We had Steve Cecil and his team then, in 1999, do a report and recommendations for Cottage Street, talking about infrastructure improvements, way to improve the streetscape, and a whole list of recommendations. We have implemented a lot of those recommendations, not all, but a lot of them. As a result, we now have a really thriving Cottage Street cultural district, and I think a lot of where we are today on Cottage Street is a result of the small grant that we got from DHCD and the MIDI program and the Cecil Group's work. So we're trying to replicate those efforts now, again, on Union Street. So we are starting, it's a very small grant, but they are here to give us their professional expertise to talk about design, urban design, streetscape, and to lead us in a really engaging and exciting discussion of where we can go on Union Street to make it just as walkable and fantastic as our cultural district on Cottage Street. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I think this is about the only time we're going to have a big public discussion because this is a very small grant. So if you've got something to say, don't be shy. Today is the day to say it. They'll come back out later on, a couple months, to maybe do a final presentation of their recommendations. But if you've got something to say about Union Street and how it flows pedestrian-wise, bike-wise, traffic, now's your time to shine. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to lead us tonight in our discussions.
Terrific. Well, I'm really pleased to be here. It seems like 1999 was just around the corner, and I'm really pleased to say that I haven't aged a bit. You haven't either. But in fact, one of the great things about the downtown initiative that we are consultants to, that the state does, is it takes communities that have been in kind of the same circumstance for a while and tries to jumpstart it, just move a little bit forward. And as you're driving around or you're going to different communities in Massachusetts today, you've seen some downtowns and town centers that are remarkable, the degree in which they've changed and how charming they can be and how much of a contributor they can be to the economy and the culture of the towns and cities that they're in. And so we have the opportunity to work in a variety of communities through this kind of jumpstart to set the stage. I was describing what this is like. It's a little bit like setting the stage for dinner. We're going to get the hors d'oeuvres in terms of what the future of the streetscape may be, and you're going to help us do that. We're setting the table so that the city is in a good position to go get the funding, the finances, to pay for a full-blown design process to get into the technical issues to really improve things. But you've got to start from a place where you look at the future differently than it is today. And what you're going to help us with this evening is help us understand through your eyes. We want to be able to see Union Street through your eyes and share with your neighbors what you think about Union Street. What do you think the opportunities are? But we're going to make this a hands-on, and as we were describing, a feet-on opportunity. The overall agenda has several parts, and I should, by the way, introduce myself again. Steve Cecil from the Cecil Group, and Joe Strayer, who's a landscape architect and urban designer with our group, is going to be helping me this evening and working together with our team back in the office. So the topics, and this is one of those discussions where the images are on the slide over there. I'm over here. I'll just keep talking. You can look over there. I'm still here. But we're going to be talking a little bit about what the goals for this, but what the process is that we're using to create a vision for the streetscape. We're going to do a little bit of a discussion about how to think about streetscapes, some examples. We're going to take a site walk and walk up and down Union Street, and we've got some handouts so that you can record some of the thoughts that you have along the way, because we really want to look. And then we're going to come back, so it can't be a very long walk. We're going to sit down in groups, and we're going to ask you to help us. We've got some maps to show us where you think the really problems are that could be made better, but also what the really good things are that we want to make sure are saved, are reinforced, are enhanced. Now, in thinking about this, the goal of this process is to try to create a clear vision to the streetscape enhancement. It will be a clear vision, like a vision. There will be a lot of details and changes that might occur. But a streetscape enhancement, what is a streetscape? Streetscape is really everything from the faces of the buildings in. So it's the streets, the curbs, the signage, the trees, the what we call street furniture. It may go around the corners. It's that environment that when you're walking, bicycling, or you're a motorist, is you perceive as what that street is. So that's what we're looking at. We're not going to be redesigning buildings' facades or thinking about new uses or any comments about the food in any one of the restaurants or any of that. We're about what happens on the outside of the buildings. Now, the thing that makes Union Street such an important thing is that it's such a highly visible gateway. It's a gateway in multiple directions. It's a gateway to the downtown, from the downtown. You have this wonderful vista that shows up on your city seal at the foot of Union Street. That's where that's taken from. But I think that as part of this, is a connector. It's a very busy connector with a lot of through traffic. It's a little bit in between. Is it a shopping street? Is it a walking street? Is it a place to just travel through? But it's got to be really successful as a connection. It needs to be a friendly place for all the people who are there, which are pedestrians and motorists. But as we are increasingly in our communities, having bicycling be a very important part of moving around. In the end, a really good streetscape approach is a fundamental part of reinforcing the economic value of a community. It's very interesting working with private sector developers at larger scale developments that we do. And when they're doing retail developments, for example, they spend a lot of money on the streetscape. And it's not because they're aesthetically interesting people who like to see brick and nice trees. It's because people will come to places that are more pleasant. It's a business strategy. So we have to understand that it's a civic idea, how to have a better town, but it's also just plain good business to figure out a way to do this. And part of the business that we'll be working with is to try to see how you can garner, in addition to whatever resources you might imagine locally. The state and federal government have been very helpful at times in funding these things. We're headed there. We're going to be using the input and the understanding of the conditions out there. We'll do a concept plan. We're going to go through a process just like we were designing it and be as smart as we possibly can and provide documentation to show what this place could be like and provide you the support information to help for that next phase, the full meal. Now, the area that we're talking about, one of the great things about Union Street is it runs from the downtown down to the former mill pond, and it's a very discrete segment of the community. So if you think about it, we've got some charts up here, and I'll go back, but we're looking at an area down from Cottage Street and Wilson. Of course, we're over here, headed up to Main Street. While we're looking at the streetscape, our maps make sure that we look at the parcels and where the parking is. We look back a little bit further because we need to know what's around the corner. But we're really focusing on the front doors of those things. So what I thought I'd do is take a few minutes and talk about how people who do streetscape design, like the folks in our company, think a little bit about a streetscape and talk about a few of the principles, some of the problems, and things you may want to keep in mind. This is a series of principles talking about the notion of you need to have it continuous and connected. That's what a streetscape is when it's really working. It's got to look right for the area. This is down in Norwalk, Connecticut, and the brick used in the street and the historic lights match the historic qualities of those storefronts. To be a community, it needs to be a sociable place. It's a place that when people do pause, and you want them to pause, there's a chance to meet people, other people, and converse. It's a conversation. There is no such thing as a streetscape that is dull and boring and great. So interest and variety and how you provide for that a really important idea. The quality and care and the ability to care for it is critical. It was really interesting. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to fly around the United States doing research for a project and why people liked and didn't like different open spaces. And it turns out the most important factor was whether it was well maintained or not. Not how it was designed, not how much brick or how many. It was like places that were not well maintained, people didn't like. But you got to be thoughtful about how you set it up so they can be maintained. We're in a world where all of us at one point in our lives or other are going to have most likely some accessibility issues. We've got to take care of the little kids, older folks, people with various kinds of challenges. So that's a need we're thinking about. Safety and security, getting across the street, sidewalks and crosswalks that actually work. This is New England, and Easthampton is definitely in New England in terms of the wintertime situations that you have. So we have to always think about the snow. What is it like in February? Are we designing for it? And then there's this cool word diurnality, which means we got to design for the nighttime condition as well as the daytime condition. And with some lighting and the way you do that, you know, you've been in towns where at nighttime you go, wow, there's something really cool about this place. It's because they thought about the lighting. Many of our images of what a streetscape could or should be go back to the 18th and 19th century. This is a picture of Great Barrington, Mass. Have you ever been down to Great Barrington? And we did work there, and they've got a most remarkable set of photographs of their main street. This is actually Depot Street we're looking at there. And this is before sidewalks. This is just as sidewalks were coming in. And so we were able to trace the history of this. Sidewalks actually came in not too early. Originally, there were just these porches on the front of the buildings, and you stepped down into the mud, the packed mud. That was what the sidewalk was, and the horses pulled up right along that edge. And of course, walking in that mud wasn't so great. So the next thing that came along were the crosswalks. And in Great Barrington, along this whole area, they were marble. The marble came down from Vermont. We had marble crosswalks and muddy, awful streets and only some sidewalks. It wasn't until later that we put all these things together. And then the automobile, of course, comes along. I love this photograph because can you imagine a world where almost all the automobiles look the same? But when they arrived, they really filled up some of the places and spaces of our streets, and they changed the way we think and use them. We talk a lot about zoning for different areas of a sidewalk on a streetscape. So there's usually a clear zone where people are moving along, and there's a furnishing zone. There's this edge which gets the collection of really utilitarian things that need to happen. Those zones are things that we track and try to understand, and they can come in different ways. There's where, of course, the automobile is, and there are different ways of treating them. But if you understand them as different zones where the plannings occur. Here's Falmouth. This is the Falmouth streetscape that we designed a number of years ago, and we came up with the community with the idea of having that edge be real gardens. They are real, unbelievable gardens that different people tend. Actually, they were also doing a second purpose, which is the sidewalks were so steep that they were not meeting handicap standards. So we had this area we didn't know what else to do, so we planted them and it turned into a feature. But that's what you're seeing is that notion of zones, and they can hop around and move. When they're not well treated, you know it, right? It's kind of in the but you look at places. This is the new Pine Hills development down in Plymouth, and they thought a lot. And there are a lot of different ways of doing it. How deep is the landscape? How much is the area that's being used for the streetscaping? It really varies. But if you have gaps in a streetscape, it's a real problem. Victor Gruen was the inventor of the modern shopping mall. People are in Southern California. And he had a principle that said if you had a blank wall 60 feet, a gap of 60 feet, people in a shopping center would not cross that gap and would not keep shopping. That's how, and if you start to look at it, you go to a mall and you've got, you see the empty storefront coming soon, it deadens things immensely. And so when we have the streets and you have a big parking lot, maybe those are nice U plants. This is in Framingham. But the reality is it's really hard to get people across. You're trying to always come up with something to keep it interesting, to keep people moving along. It's a very, very important idea. And often when we turn corners, this is in Norwood, Massachusetts, this is one of the most awful corners we could find. People are moving along the main street, you turn down the side street, and I ain't going there, no way. So just thinking about that business of things, even like changes in grade, you don't have very much of this. This is up in Castine, Maine. And the building on the left-hand side is constantly for rent. The building on the right-hand side, the bottom of the hill, has lots of strong uses all the time. You have this problem, which Randolph has, that there is a lot of moving traffic for segments right near the sidewalk. And for pedestrians, that can be not such a great condition. And for motorists, when there isn't a lot of traffic, that's a speeding opportunity to a certain degree. So you have to understand that places that are good for people often do something different along those edges. We've talked about the maintenance and just how deading it can be, and that's part of the circumstance, but even changes of materials can be problematic. This is valuable, famous Nantucket on the right-hand side. It's so funny, people say, oh, what a wonderful, charming place it is. In most towns, you look at that and say, why don't they fix up their streets? It looks terrible. But the fact of the matter is that if you create the sidewalk on the left, many people, particularly people who have difficulty either seeing or walking, have difficulty making transitions from one surface to the other. It's really interesting. And so what you want to do is create continuous paths that are simple for people to move along with detail and other things in areas where they're not necessarily walking. And that's a really, really important idea if you want people to feel comfortable in terms of how they're moving around. So in thinking about this, we do have these problems, and you have one, automobile-oriented intersections, where there's just too many automobiles and not enough people. That image on the right actually is a sculpture. I saw that, and I tracked it down because it's somebody having just a ton of fun with humor.
Is it in Europe, I assume?
It is. I think it's in Scotland, is what I'm told. But it gets the idea across so well of how we often treat intersection. The intersection on the left is an intersection in Watertown Square that we did a lot of work on, and the crossing distances are so huge. There's so much traffic. It's a real challenge. We talk, and you'll hear urban designers and landscape architects talk about street walls. What's a street wall? A street wall, it's pretty important to understand that people tend to feel more comfortable in defined corridors and spaces, and when it leaks off the side like this, in this circumstance, there's one side of the street it's pleasant, the other side it's a parking lot. If you create a kind of an edge, a visual edge along the edge of a street, it really makes it much more pleasant for pedestrians. It's a very fundamental thing that people have understood for a long time. So as we take a look at sidewalks, there's so many different materials. This is in Falmouth, where we used a bluestone out of New York to complement special concrete that was in place. There's so many different planting materials. There's a richness of things that can occur. We don't need to work with the straight lines of streets. We can do different things. One thing that many places have used, this is a streetscape we did in Stoughton, where and you see these, people call them bump outs or sidewalk projections. You can find places where cars aren't supposed to be, and rather than have them be asphalt, you can make them other materials. And it really does another important thing, which is it diminishes the distance between the landing spots for pedestrians, and shortening up that distance makes a lot of sense. So there are locations and communities where this has been an important part of their streetscaping. And people get very excited sometimes about the opportunities for the paving materials themselves. We are actually not a big fan of paving materials that go right across the street and right up onto the sidewalk. We want to make sure that people do know which is which. But we thought this was a pretty incredible application of granite and brick for a crosswalk. So you can do a lot of different things. But there are a lot of materials that are available today, including some of the pressed materials that have kind of a texture or even coloring or other ways of distinguishing where people should be, where cars should be, and making that a transition that works well. This idea of mid-block crossings, when you have large expanses of places where people can land before they take off and make the next segment, can be really important conditions. And then just interest in variety. When we worked in Marblehead, they couldn't decide whether they knew they didn't want to have it look like Disneyland with a carpet that was just all the same. And so we came up with this idea that people would choose whether they wanted to have brick or whether they want to have concrete in front of their place. And at first it looked a little strange, but within a year or two, it looked like a sidewalk that built up over time in a historic town. Well, guess what? That's what Marblehead is. So, and it's actually far more interesting than if we just made one material the whole way. In finding those special places, the old grindstone, a place where a garden can come out, the little odd pieces that make things work, and public art can and should be part of this in the right circumstance. We have to remember that part of our work here in Easthampton together is thinking a lot about the notion of culture and cultural arts, and you have a really interesting community in that regard that people recognize. That's something. I mean, when I say I'm doing work in Easthampton, I say, oh, that's really cool. They've got crafts, they got shops over there, and the people who live there and do that sort of stuff, they know you like that. And that's something that you can make present, you can make visible. So this is a friend of ours in Seattle, Jack Mackey, and what he did is he cast dance steps in the sidewalk in front of this on the street where there are a lot of cafes and bars. And what you do, you walk up and you look at them, and it'll tell you how to do a foxtrot. The next thing you know, people are grabbing a partner, and they're doing the cha-cha-cha. Well, there's nothing like sitting in there having a beer, looking out the window, and watching people dance up and down the street. That's truly wild. They've made it come alive, but when it's not in use, it doesn't look strange. It's just a bunch of grass in the sidewalks. There are lots of examples of how you can make a place come alive and be really a good thing. And we'll be thinking about the nighttime. A lot of the nighttime lighting is in the buildings, but the way you pick and how you use your street lights gives a very different circumstance. In today's world, sustainability is something we think a lot about, and so part of the idea is that a complete street can accomplish a lot of things. Just the way you treat it, you can do cleaning of the water as it runs off. You can provide planting spaces that make sense. I just was in Seattle, and I've been doing some teaching on urban agriculture, and I came across the fact that that planting strip in Seattle, people are using them for food gardens now. And you walk up and down the street, and there's tomatoes there. So there are things about being the landscape that you can do very differently. And finally, the final thing I wanted to say is that signage is extremely important. You may come to know what the name of the street is or where the parking lot is, but people who you want to invite into your community and give a sense of where it is, you need to tell them where to go. Doing that in a way that is suited to the overall look and feel, whether that's part of the artistic expression of the community or whether it's something much simpler, are choices that you have. So that's a very brief overview of what's a very complex set of choices that we have. And I thought I'd pause and see if there's some questions, a few questions, a few thoughts, and then we'll head out and we're going to actually go look at Union Street, hopefully with a little bit critical of new eyes. Any questions? Everybody's the right meeting? Yeah.
Yeah, we thought for a long time about Union Street going the electrical underground as opposed to hanging down the street.
Yep.
That should be a consideration, I think.
Mm-hmm. A lot of communities have done it. It can be complicated. It can be relatively simple. There are a lot of things that are involved in it, but and I'm sure you've seen communities where they've done it and what amazing differences can happen. Yeah.
So when you, could you go back and at the very introduction of your talk, you said that in thinking about streetscape, you weren't thinking about the kinds of properties or the kind of commercial activity or the kinds of stores or whatever facilities there were along the street. So are you telling us that in considering streetscape, it's just about street furniture basically, and crossing and traffic maintenance and stuff?
We're really dealing with what we call the public realm. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's a little bit on private property, but it's the sidewalks, the streets, the curbs, the crosswalks, the lighting, the trees. But when you start thinking about that, you've got to think about what's on the other side of that line. So the way that you approach where the rail trail crosses, or you got to know about that rail trail. If you've got what's the front door to a cafe, that's a very different way you're thinking about it. So we've got to know what our neighbors are and making sure that we're supporting that or creating a kind of a streetscape that makes sense. But what this particular process is not doing is doing plans for the properties themselves. That's an important process. There's lots to do. We're just going to focus on the public realm.
seems very provocative, and one wonders how you can even address that in a situation as chaotic as Union Street. But
That's what we're going to find out. That's what we're going to find out. So what we're going to do is, we shouldn't all bunch up because the sidewalks aren't that wide. We've got a handout. Maybe Joe, we can send a handout. And if you've got a pen, if you don't, we've got some extra pens. You can take notes or just memorize things as you go out. But what I want you to do is, and maybe what we can do is to split up. One can go up. A bunch of us can go up one side of the street. The other side of the street will cross up at Main Street and come back down. It should take us, maybe it's about a 10-12 minute walk. We should be actually here by 7:30 at the latest. Okay. So if you only get halfway up, then come halfway back, I guess. But what we want to do is just walk and really look at it. Now, we thought about some of those themes. What's the width of the street? What's the condition of the street? Where's there parking? Where there's not parking? What about people crossing over? What's actually out there? And this is an area that I'm sure many of you are incredibly familiar with. But we want to have you look at it a little bit through the eyes where you're saying, this could change. Where is it that I think it could or should change and where it isn't? Just take a look at it. We'll talk. I'm interested in talking to you as we walk along. Then we're going to come back. With the ideas or just from the observations that you've had, then we're going to break into 3 working groups. We're going to separate the tables, so we're going to lay some drawings out, and we're going to go around and we're going to ask you, what do you think are the things that should change? And they really should change. What are the things that are really good and you better reinforce them and make sure that they don't change, at least in a bad way? And what do we think as far as that's concerned in terms of the opportunities for the future? And we'll learn a lot through this process, but the best thing, because it's a nice evening, it's the summer, let's go out and just actually look at it and come back, okay?
No detour to Tom's for ice cream cars?
You may.
That'll use up your walking time.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's not on Union Street.